Tonight we've got Francesca Pontini delivering a paper entitled Two Known Readers in Early Modern Scotland, William Scheves and George Buchanan. Francesca earned a master's degree in library studies from the University of Bologna in 2016 and wrote her thesis on marginalia. That same year she moved to Scotland and extended her initial stay of 1 year to continue her studies. She worked in university libraries and at the National Library of Scotland before starting a PhD in English at the University of Stirling in 2020, for which she received a grant from the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities. Francesca is currently working on her dissertation, which focuses on readers, marginalia and writing practices in Scotland between 1450 and 1560. So welcome, Francesca.
Thank you so much for this lovely presentation and for inviting me. I'm quite excited to present my research tonight. As the title says, today we are going to explore how two different readers annotated their books. They're both two pivotal figures in Scottish history, William Scheves or Scheves, nobody knows, and George Buchanan. Before talking about their marginalia, I would like to introduce them to you, talking a little bit about their life, because not everybody knows them, and then I will illustrate their annotating behavior. William Scheves studied at the University of St Andrews and was a master there in 1460. He was also a student in Louvain and worked at James III court before becoming Archbishop of St Andrews in 1478. Scheves had some political difficulties under the reign of James IV, but nonetheless, he became a central figure for church in Scotland. He liaised with Rome to strengthen St Andrews' position, and he traveled to and from the papal city quite a lot. His presence was recorded in Louvain, Paris, and he probably acquired most of his printed book during these travels. After a long and fruitful career, Scheves died in 1497, regarded as an excellent scholar, physician, and administrator. After his death, his library was dispersed, but previous studies have listed several books with his ownership mark, and his book collecting was very well known in his own age as well. George Buchanan, on the other hand, is probably more famous than Scheves. But just as a brief reminder, George Buchanan's life was an itinerant one, both by choice and by necessity. It is not clear where his pre-university education took place. Legend wants it to be in Kildare, but since there was not a grammar school in Kildare until the 17th century, this is probably legend. It is more likely that he was in a local burgh school or in Glasgow. In any case, he was first educated in Scotland. Therefore, his early graphic education was in the secretary hand. This is going to be important for our discussion after this. He first entered into contact, in contact with humanist ideas and study methods at the University of Paris, where he studied in 1520. It is highly likely that at this point, he also started learning the humanistic and italic script, and we'll see why this is important in a bit. Just as a reminder, the humanist script or italic script was a script used by individuals working mostly in chancery and by humanist scholars. Buchanan returned to Scotland in 1522, where he studied logic at St Andrews with John Mayer, and he graduated from St Andrews in 1525, and the next year he moved again to Paris following Mayer. This part of his life was under John Mayer. In 1528, he gained his master's from the University of Paris and started a teaching career that brought him to St Barbe, Paris, and Scotland in 1537 as a private tutor to Gilbert Kennedy. After the Protestant prosecution of 1539, Buchanan had to escape to Paris and was later invited to Bordeaux to teach Latin at the College of Guyenne, where he also taught Michel de Montaigne. He moved again to Paris in 1542 and probably taught at the College of Cardinal Lemoine. In 1547, he was invited to Coimbra in Portugal to teach at the university, but here he had several issues with the Portuguese Inquisition, so much so that he was under trial and the trial ended in Buchanan's imprisonment in 1550 for 7 months. He was finally allowed to leave Portugal 2 years later, in 1552, and return to Paris, where he stayed probably until 1560, when he finally returned to Scotland. Historians believe that at this point he fully converted to Protestantism. In Scotland, he was tutor to Mary Queen of Scots, and in 1566 was principal of St. Leonard's College in St. Andrews. He also tutored the future James VI and held several offices, such as the keeper of the Privy Seal of Scotland. And he spent his last year completing the Rerum Scoticarum Historia that was published in Edinburgh the same year, not the year before his death, in 1581, and he died in 1582. I know that these two figures may appear to be like a strange match to talk about reading practices. William Scheves was an archbishop, while Buchanan was a humanist. And why putting them together? I do see them as two figures that can define an era and also testify how the world can change in less than a century. They are at the beginning, Scheves, and at the end of a very specific time for Scotland and Europe. William Scheves saw the invention and the spread of the printed books, so much so that he was one of the very first printed books owner in Scotland. And he was the very first one to add them to his own collection. On the other hand, Buchanan gave printed books for granted. He was born in 1520, he was studying in 1520, died in 1582. He knew printed books very well. But they're also representative of their time period. Scheves was an archbishop, and the large majority of the books that survived from his collection, they were in his library. They were copies of theology texts, such as St. Augustine or Peter Lombard. On the other hand, Buchanan preferred classical authors, such as Cicero and Ovidius, and we'll see an Ovidius tonight. Only by these snippets of information, we can see how the world quickly changed. Scheves' world was one where Christianity was united and perceived as strong, while Buchanan lived his life in a fractured Christianity. He had issues with the Inquisition. He had a tormented religious conscience. And Protestantism was strong, so much so that he became a Protestant. Buchanan was a man who fully took on the new education paradigm of humanists, for which the study of great classicals was the most important topic to study and share, to be considered an highly learned man. But to fully appreciate our readers, we have to focus on the marginalia that they left behind. So we can't, I believe, personally, we can't just focus on what they produced, specifically on Buchanan, but it's a good idea to also look at what they actually read. I believe the marginalia are the most tangible proof that a book was actually read by someone. We could, of course, consider a signature on the book enough, or study an author's work looking for cross-references or other works, either explicit or implicit reference. But what about what they read? The paragraphs they were most interested in, and the one they didn't annotate? This type of information can be given only by marginalia themselves. So let's start with our Archbishop. As I said before, his library is the one that we could expect from an Archbishop. Amongst his books, there are St. Augustine and Peter Lombard, and this Sammelband full of theological works. But his use of books is not only about marginalia, but it's also focused, as you can see, on the willingness to navigate the text. So as you can see in the image, here he produced what we can define a table of content in his own hand. The very first thing I thought when I saw it, it was that this is extremely modern. We can recognize the different part of a contemporary table of content. Contenitur in histo libello at the very top, at the center of the page. After that, we can notice one of the printed items not being numbered for some reason, like it would be for an introduction or a paratext. After that, every single item is numbered, and the title of the item is connected to the page number by a line. Clearly, Scheves wanted to guide himself, and maybe someone else, maybe a future reader, or himself as a future reader, to find the right text at the right page. There is more. The layout of the page and the control that he practices on his script testify to the fact that he had a certain level of acquaintance with the production of manuscripts. Again, this should not surprise us. We know that he studied in Paris. Manuscripts were produced there for students and sometimes by students themselves that became professional scribes. I'm not suggesting that Scheves was a professional scribe himself, but his control of the pen, the page layout, testify to someone who was very well acquainted with manuscript and manuscript processes. What about his marginalia? What Scheves does, he works on his text at different levels. The most basic one, we have simple repetition of keywords, as you can see in the image. In other cases, Scheves writes some cross-reference inside the text, so maybe writes terzo capitolo, quindicesimo capitolo. But it does not only write the reference to other chapter, but also tries to highlight that cross-reference with figures that resemble some small flowers. So I don't know how many of you here are well acquainted with medieval and early modern manuscripts, but the small flowers are something that keep cropping up in my research. And if anyone saw them, let me know, please. In this case, the marginalia is not only a written reminder, but also a visual aid created to locate specific portion on the page. Keep these written features in mind, please. Some of them are quite similar to Buchanan, and we'll see them again in a bit. But Scheves not only writes keywords in the margins, but also longer comments. In another book, this time the complete work of Peter Lombard, Scheves writes what looks like a summary note, adding his own twist. In the printed text, Peter Lombard discusses what constitutes a happy life and how to achieve this happy life in also order to enjoy the afterlife. It's very complex, I know. Peter Lombard warns the reader that hope should not be put in men, but then recalls St. Paul's argument in the letter to Philemon, where he says that Christians should love and play so also in Christian brothers in Christianity. Scheves Lombard cites St. Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana and sustains that men should place their hope exclusively in God. Scheves agrees to a point. He writes, spes est una de adventore et perducendi et adunante affame, sit ecclesia, tamen de beatitudine vita dulcedo, et etas nostras alia esset, salvatorum et beatificorus, quest ultique suius ad quem suorum ordinorum et solo Deo est sperandus. The translation and the full comprehension of this marginalium could appear confusing. If you know a bit of palaeography, you might be a bit confused by some of my transcription, I know. This is due to the fact that some abbreviations are not of instant understanding. Specifically here, Scheves uses a very quick form of the abbreviation, of the Tyronian abbreviation in a form of a 7 et, before the word etas, for instance, which is something I didn't see very often, honestly. We'll discuss this again in a little bit, and we'll discuss what does this mean for the marginalia produced here for a private or a shared use. Getting back to the annotation, we can see that, like the printed text, it comments on whether Christianity should put their hope. Scheves starts with a strong sentence: hope is one. The newcomers will be conducted to hope due to a crave, probably for truth. But the real hope we must place in the church is about a blessed and sweet life. The other life awaits after death, and that can be reached only by people saved and beatified. The saved and beatified if you know a bit of history of religion, there is a bit of Luther here, of the problem of St. Paul. It is the last goal of someone's life, and we can put our hope exclusively in God. It does not only agree with the text, but also reflects on by whom and how the eternal life will be reached. But there is more. Scheves identifies the church and God as the two vessels to reach salvation. You can recognize someone who perceived and believed in a united church with this beatification aspect. As you can notice, I hope, in the two different, so this is the main material, and here in another ink, there is another annotation still in Scheves. It's written in a different ink. And you can also notice that the two parts of the marginalium, so there are two different annotations, are set apart from each other by a straightish line, more or less. The second part, or the lower part, because I don't know what came first or second, it says argumentum apostoli dicitat Philomone, indicating that in the printed paragraph, the author recalls the position of St. Paul in the letters to Philemon. So this is, again, a keyword, a simple reminder. So again, he read on two different levels. It's not a case that the briefer marginalia is in a clearer link. It is likely that he first read to find the main argument and annotated the page accordingly. Later, I believe he went back to some of these topics and wrote longer marginalia, result of a more focused and thoughtful reading practice. Also, you can probably appreciate the fact that this type of comment by someone who studied this is produced by someone who studied this theology thoroughly. This is just one example that I can provide you due to time, but there will be more in my PhD dissertation. And it is an archbishop comment. I'm leaving you with a little thought that we'll discuss later. This could be a homily, or could also be something that he used to teach his students. And again, the nature of marginalia will be discussed in a bit. What about Buchanan? The uses make of his books is similar in some aspects, but different in others. Buchanan's way of reading is representative of a different age. First of all, the genre of the text is completely different from the one Scheves preferred. In his donation to Glasgow University, there are only classical texts, both in Greek and Latin. Also, the book in Edinburgh University Library and the one in St. Andrews are both two classical Latin texts. They should not surprise us. As I said before, Buchanan is famous for being one of the most learned humanists of his age. Also, at this point in time, the humanist curriculum has almost taken over several educational institutions. In some circles now, it is more important to know Cicero than St. Augustine. So how does Buchanan use his books? Similar to Scheves, he uses keywords. We'll see them in the next slides. But differently from Scheves, he prefers to write the keyword as close as possible to the text. Furthermore, he writes in Greek, often synonyms. His keywords have a double function. He uses to navigate the text, like Scheves did, but also to practice his philological skills. And we'll see this now. And this love for philology transpires strongly in his longer comments, for instance, this one. It's quite simple. It just says, Plautus rudente, non vides reperre me vidum rete sine squamoso pecum, Virgilius, liber quator, Georgica, de apropos locor, et pecudum custodia solers, ex nonio Marcellius, 1285. You're like, well, that looks pretty simple. So the marginalia analyzed here is the end of the second ode of the first book of Horatius. In the ode, Horatius describes the flood of Tiber. Buchanan writes 3 references to other Latin authors. This first one is a reference to Plautus' comedy The Rope, or Pause, and it is a word-by-word transcription. non vides referre me stands for, don't you see I'm taking back a wet net without any scaly livestock? The second cross-reference is from the fourth book of Virgil's Georgics, or Georgica. Specifically, Buchanan writes, speaking about bees. But the following sentence is not referring to bees. The sentence starting with et pecudum means and the care of livestock with skills. If you go and check the complete Virgil's test, like I did, because I couldn't understand where he was going, what he was doing, this part of the care of livestock with skills is a description by Virgil focused on a shepherd, Aristeus, who, desperate for the loss of his bees, asks Cyrene why his life is so hard and laments that he achieved very little through the care of livestock and crops. In this case, the whole meaning of the marginalium becomes clear only if we have access to the complete text. Otherwise, the reference to the bees is baffling, and I'm sure you're still baffled, but give me 1 second. The third cross-reference, as of today, is cryptic to me. The author cited is, I believe, Nonius Marcellius, the grammarian, but the number 1285 could be a page number, a line, another type of code. I don't know what is he talking about. I tried to look for the word pecus or pecum in some editions, but no luck yet. This last cross-reference is particularly obscure. So even without the text search that we are allowed today, it would be almost impossible to define the right line of Plautus, Rudens, or the complex context of Virgil's livestock quote. The reader could also be a bit perplexed about the presence of these cross-references next to an ode that talks about floods. Buchanan's note becomes clearer if we read the comment around the ode. So you can probably, you can notice it quite easily. The comment, which is what we call a complex comment, the comment is about the whole ode. So I got lost. The last part of the comment explains to the reader that, according to legend, in consequences of these floods, new monsters emerged since some fishes stayed on the top of trees. You have to imagine this big river taking over Rome and all the creatures on top of trees. The creatures on top of the trees were called pecus. Now, considering the comment, it appears clear that the cross-reference are not related to the flood of Tiber or poor Ovidius in this case, Horatius, but is related exclusively to the word pecus or pecum. So Buchanan writes down in which texts he saw the word pecum and how they were used. So we have the scaly livestock, the squamoso pecus, and the pecum in Virgil, and probably a pecum in Nonius Marcellius, I hope. I don't know. So this particular marginalium is of a philological nature. Buchanan was interested in reconstructing the etymology and the use of the word pecum in different Latin authors. The precision of his reference work is striking. Reconstructing precisely where this reference came from was possible only through text search, honestly, inside digital texts. And inevitably, the modern reader wonders if Buchanan knew his authors by heart, or if he had a library so rich that he was able to go from one text to another. There is another marginalia easier this time, that allows us to see inside Buchanan's way of work. In this case, the cross-reference is not linked to grammar, but is linked to literary topics. If you remember your Latin, Martiale libere secundo sette, frange toro, spete vina, rosa cape, tingere nardo, ipse iubis mortis te, menimisse deus, which translates from Marshall's second book, break the dining couches, request wine, crown yourself with roses, plunge in the nardo, God himself commands you to remember that. Clearly, if we think Martialis and Ovidius being together, in this case, he was tracing the similarity of themes in these two poets. Life is fleeting, death looms, we must enjoy the wine as long as we can, if we can. And he also displays, as you can notice, the similar habit that we saw in Scheves' reading practice, writing keywords to navigate the text. But what Buchanan does with his own books is not limited to annotating them with cross-reference and keywords, but also something else. The book in question is part of the donation made by Buchanan to Glasgow University Library. It is once again a printed classic, a kicker in this case. Buchanan reveals himself at the end of the book, writing one of his poems, a Versum of the Sonium Franciscanus. The poem is in one of the final flyleaves. The use of the book is not unheard of. During the archival research for my PhD, I saw several owners and readers writing notes in the flyleaves. After all, they're the perfect space to write ideas related to the text and to use some spare paper. When we approach the history of the book, we must always remember that paper was extremely expensive. But why would Buchanan use the final flyleaves of a Cicero to write his own poem? This poem does not appear to be an initial draft. As you can see in the slide, there are no cancellations. Is fairly similar to the one that was published. So I have two hypotheses. The first one is very simple. Buchanan just decided to try his pen and try his poetry in one of his books. And then this book ended up in Glasgow University because he decided to donate it. The other option that I find more fascinating, but it's very hard to prove, is that the writing of that poem was done by Buchanan with a double goal in mind. And this option was suggested to me by David Randall. First, to make sure that he was remembered as the donor of the book, but also to be seen as a part of the humanist circles. So writing in a Cicero as Buchanan has a significance. The option linked to this is that maybe this could be a performative poem, meaning that while donating the book, Buchanan wanted to show his possible audience that he was able to write a poem by heart, and he showed that on the first book available. There is another instance of this in a different context at Oxford, but in Buchanan's case, up until now, I could not find any witness of this practice, nobody that says, oh yes, I saw this. So I would leave it as an hypothesis. So what do these two readers tell us about the changing and, in some cases, not changing ways of reading? So the first thing we must observe is the fact that both our readers decided to use keywords to navigate the printed text. They are two different generations, and they had quite a different education, but both of them write in the margins, probably as a reminder for themselves and to refine text portions. There is, how can we explain this? I believe there is a common need that is expressed through these keywords. But I believe there is something more. What I'm starting to define a common educational pattern that is probably much older than Scheves. If any of you here is a medievalist or someone who is well acquainted with manuscript, they know that writing keywords in the margins is as old as the Codex himself. But Buchanan and Scheves, they still do the same. Were they taught? I believe so. And I believe that pupils in general were taught to analyze the text and prepare it using keywords and small summaries. And the preparation was for their future studies and to use them in their professional endeavors. But if we take in consideration the small summaries, then we can see how different they are. Scheves is a proper archbishop. He writes about faith, he summarizes parts of the chapter that are relevant to sacraments. He appears to use his books for his work, but Is it only a pastoral work? This is a question I wondered on while studying his books and also all the others that I saw. Did he have someone else in mind while writing his marginalia? And the same question arises for Buchanan, at least for me, and all this we'll say more in a bit. Before we must notice the main difference between the two is the nature of the cross-reference. Scheves' cross-reference are limited to some chapters in the same book. Buchanan's are a result of accurate philological work. We can see in the shift between these two readers another more complex cultural shift, the passage between the scholastic and the humanist studies. Again, Scheves is a man of the church, a church that is still united, and his interests reflect his role in the society. Buchanan is a humanist. He double-checks his sources, he makes complex connections, not always clear to the contemporary reader. But both of them still use their writing practice to navigate the text. The results are different, but the framework, the need to navigate the text, and some tools are still the same. Now, the question I posed, I thought, I keep thinking every day, are these marginalia produced for someone else? I still struggle in arguing for one or the other case, so for a private reading practice or a shared reading practice. On one side, there is the fact that Scheves, in his marginalia, uses a very peculiar abbreviation system. So peculiar, in fact, that often I have to use the Capelli's dictionary. So Capelli was an archivist and palaeographer who wrote these dictionaries of Latin abbreviations. And I need to use it daily when I study Scheves. The counter argument is, if Capelli managed to find and decode the very same abbreviations, they must have been shared among learned scribes. Otherwise, I would not find them. Therefore, it is highly likely that a contemporary of Scheves who was much well versed in reading abbreviated scripts would have had more skills than myself in reading his marginalia. So I have two arguments, I know. For Buchanan, the problem is quite similar. But there is another aspect to keep in consideration. As you probably noticed, Buchanan was digraphic. Sometimes he writes in humanistic, sometimes he writes in secretary hand. He was able to produce at least two different scripts. The use of the italic hand at this point would indicate that he wanted for his marginalia to be read. But at this point in time, it's also the end for international communication. As we saw in the examples, before the nature of his marginalia, the nature of his marginalia is cryptic, and the cross-references need specific knowledge to be understood and contextualized. Producing this type of marginalia for someone else, I believe it defeats the purpose of using an italic hand or a humanistic hand. Furthermore, when he uses his secretary hand for a book that actually ended up in a donation, Buchanan is not cryptic. He writes clearly what is the poem and who wrote it. And he writes, "This book is mine, George Buchanan." For this reason, I'm honestly more inclined to believe that both these reading and writing practices are more private than shared. But I still leave the option open that they might have been produced for someone else, because some elements of it are contradictory. I do see it. So concluding, Scheves and Buchanan might appear like two isolated case studies, but we saw how they both need to navigate the text. The use of keywords and summary notes are two devices used in different contexts. I believe that these devices must have been learned in some way by Scheves and Buchanan, probably from their own teachers or from their own teaching circles. There is a continuity in learning and annotating practices, but they both adapt these devices to their own needs. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much for your paper. It was wonderful. We've got time to open the floor to questions. I'm going to take a share of the privilege and ask you this question, if that's okay. So, as we were going through the marginalia, I was thinking, what formats are the books generally in? Like, do they mostly have folios? And does that impact how they're being used in the marginalia?
Actually, the summer band is really small.
Yeah.
It's a small quarto, so no. It depends how much the reader is motivated to annotate the text. If the reader has enough margins, he or she, they will annotate the text as much as they can, often, not always. Most of it are folios, but also because folios were the most popular type of books back then. So there is also that aspect.
Thank you.
No worries.
Opening the floor. Anybody got a question? Elizabeth?
You say that they're both using systems of notation with some symbols and
Abbreviations.
and things, but that they must have learned it somewhere.
Yes.
Is this possibly linking up with systems of commonplacing that they were being taught and with systems that they were being taught for constructing disputations, which must have been a fundamental part of their education?
Yeah.
And are they using the same sorts of symbols? And does this suggest that these are actually part of the tuition?
The history of abbreviations is a very fascinating one. We can say that most of it, the Tironian notes, for instance, the Tironian abbreviations, yes, they're used by medieval up until late modern people. They changes. What I noticed personally is that maybe Scheves, who is more of a medieval man, he uses more abbreviations. But more we go towards the end of the 16th century, readers prefer to use a simple line or some qui, que, per, pre, if you remember all your palaeography lessons. So yes, they're there. Regarding the commonplace question, I do believe it was strongly shared, because here I brought just Buchanan and Scheves, but what I saw during the PhD research is that the readers, more or less, they have specific interest, but they use the same devices. So it must be linked somewhere, either in university education or even maybe pre-university education. So there must be a link there somewhere. There are too many using the same ways of annotating.
And presumably in Scheves, even through university, quite a lot of students are not going to have access to books that they can write in margins of. So any kind of written system, presumably, is something that they're using in notes that they're taking elsewhere.
Definitely, yeah.
Thank you.
Helen?
Thank you. It's really fascinating to see this. I have a couple of things. I'm not sure whether they're, I feel like I may be commenting more than asking a question, but with Buchanan, it was really interesting to see, so this is what goes into making a humanist like Buchanan, that kind of philological comment. And I guess it looks as if he has great recall, but maybe he is sitting with these other books open in front of him and then writing the references in this book he's reading so that he doesn't forget them.
I think so. Also, we have to remember that Buchanan was quite poor at the end of his life. So I believe that what happened there was that maybe he asked friends or families to borrow books, and then he used them to rewrite down, because it's too precise. Like he cites the book and the chapter. It's very precise. I wish my students would do that, but they don't. So I believe that maybe he was borrowing books and then writing in his own book what he needed to have everything in order. Yeah.
Excuse, I find this really interesting. Because our image of these diplomatic leading clergy in pre-Reformation Scotland is that they did not give a lot of attention to spiritual affairs, that they were very, very much acting in their role as diplomats and as advisors to the king, and they were not that concerned with pastoral practice. And so I find it fascinating that he annotates it is a religious annotation. It's whether he's writing something down to reuse in a sermon or he's making a personal reflection. It's a spiritual text. It's a spiritual comment. It's not an analytical comment. And I was thinking about William Elphinston, who is my favorite cleric, who similarly in the books he collects, the books, he has a pastoral library. And so I think this little nugget of interpretation and others of it, are there other kind of these pastoral annotations in Scheves? Does this, do you think, help us rewrite our image of these clerics as people who are more concerned with the spiritual than their usual historical image?
So I don't know if they were more concerned or if they used it also to improve their position at court. Because we have this idea of Scheves of someone who's a bit Machiavellian, isn't he? Like he's trying to use the king for his own benefits. But his annotations are strongly theological. Like he doesn't use Saint Augustine or Peter Lombard to maybe create, for instance, Elphinston sometimes comments on how to justify the power of the king towards God. Scheves does not do that. He's really worried about sacraments. In another marginalia that I'm studying, he's really worried about how sacraments are a bind between God and Christianity. And he writes about that for 10 lines straight. That's a priest concern, isn't it? Because you are administrating sacraments. So you're wondering, okay, so I'm going to administrate sacraments and I'll have to write an homily. How do I do this? I use my books and I wonder about sacraments. So yeah, I don't see Scheves as Machiavellian anymore, honestly. I see as someone really worried about his theology. Yeah.
Mark's taken on with Buchanan is a favorite of mine. Farmer's boy that got sent to Paris very young, very early. And when he got trapped in Portugal for his pains when he was put in prison, he took opportunity to get on with a bit of writing the Psalms, re-looking through the Psalms. This is quite well known. Anyway, I just want to bring from that time to now, may I tell all people, there's a wonderful article at the moment in the current London Review of Books. And it's got a 3-pager, and it is on the theme of the great obsessive printer called, I think, Aldous, but he's got a long name. And he single-handedly got out all the dust-laden manuscripts in Old Greek and some Latin, and endeavored to make his own printing press for the benefit of the Venetian princes. And he just burned himself out doing it, and he would allow no one to come into his house unless he had prompt business so they could get on with his life's work. But the impact of that time, you're talking about 1500, is that he thought with the clarity of representing in clean text and font and everything a lot to a new renaissance of that particular point in history, that they would then, it would broadcast all the princes and the people and the priests at that time, what in fact the classics contained. It really was precursor to the humanist movement. And so my question then is, the difference between Scheves and Buchanan would be that Buchanan, being a bit one generation down the line, would have possibly hundreds of beautifully produced books, and some of them are even described as being the pocketbook of the time. It was a shorter sort of book, and you might have St. Augustine in one pocket, but you would study Virgil in the other pocket. And this complete availability of the books, then in which people could, every book doesn't have life until it begins with the second reader. So these would then be communications as you would be thinking, as you would go. So would the itinerant Buchanan have had maybe a dozen of those books? What's the history, bibliographical history of those books that Aldous brought out that would then be diffusing throughout the ferment of Europe at that time, in Paris and Germany, in Germany? for the great retranslations. It was needed clarity of original text from which to base your whole lot of text into English. So the whole business of annotations became real. It was florid, in other words. And if you get from one theologian in Edinburgh, his name is Ian, he says, life begins in the marginalia. And then that's because even the irony of all is that later theologians from the Geneva Bible forward, arguments and the struggles, the marginalia begin getting printed. In other words, you've got the word, you jump from marginalia to concordances, and they're lethal because everybody takes their own interpretation of what's, okay, there's a text, but the side is as important. So you'll be an industry for some time to come.
Okay.
But can you tell us a wee bit about the number of books that maybe still extant
So
from that time? Because there's LRB's pot in its own.
if you study, of course, if you study traditional bibliography, you know that the curve is very clear. We start from the mid of the 15th century with not many books produced, and then we get at the end of the 16th century that books are everywhere in Europe. How many books Buchanan had access to, that's another problem. I didn't find as many as I hoped. So there are definitely the one in Glasgow Uni, one in Edinburgh Uni, and one in St. Andrews, at St. Andrews University. And then there is a manuscript, 2 manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The 2 differences between the Scheves and Buchanan is that Scheves was richer. So he was able to buy his books in an easier way and to collect them as he wanted to collect them. So much so that the majority of books that are in St. Andrews University Library, they're all bound by the same binder in Louvain. So Scheves was able to tell a binder, please do 10, 15 books as I want. Buchanan is not able to do that. So he maybe had more access, but in a way like we have access. So maybe he could borrow them and see them at a friend's library, but not like Scheves access them. Does it make sense what I'm saying? So he was able to read them and maybe do common placing and write them on some books. But being of limited means, he was not able to have a large library.
Although had he had command of the library, James VI,
He did.
he may have had access to not
He was absolutely able to access that. So
and wasn't he detailed by Queen Mary to be the, and is just guilty on James VI to do his grammar, and he actually.
it's good enough.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yep.
I have a completely different question, and a thought that came to me while you were talking. You were talking about marginalia. What about headings? Have you come across headings where somebody's put in a heading rather than putting in a comment? The reason I'm asking this question is because I'm working on a medieval letter collection, which is a bit older. It's sort of late 14th century. And it comes in 2 parts, basically, not in age very far apart, about 15 or 20 years. And the earlier part, it's really weird because it's all in the same hand. It's obviously one collection. And it's administrative, and whether the letters are collected for as samples for future letter writing, or whether a record is not clear. But quite obviously, after the letters had been copied, somebody was probably not the same hand, but a similar hand, squeezed in a heading, but most of them, quite obviously not at the same time,
So
because it's quite awkward.
The second that imitated the first one, writing the head.
I don't know whether it imitated it or was similar anyway. There can't have been much of a time difference, quite simply because.
So the archival material is different because the archival material requests to be used somehow. So it's kind of
Yes,
prepared.
but it was
Yeah.
navigation. You did navigation, and this would be navigation.
The headings
And
in
then-
our material.
And then about 10, 15 years later,
Yeah.
somebody else comes along.
Yeah. Because
And
someone else
what-
possibly thought, oh, I need to navigate this.
But marginal comments for most of the entire collection. So you have this awkward headline with the text of the heading,
So the-
then repeated by
So the
somebody else.
letters are 15 years previous than the
Roughly.
roughly. It's not that much. So yeah, I would say it's for navigation, because the other thing you could say is, or maybe they weren't able to read the script, the writing, so they added a summary note to be able.
Well, both of it, of course, make it quicker to find something. But I just wonder, was there a fashion in doing headlines rather than did the marginal comment, which is obviously a lot more practical if you want to find something, did that come in later? Have you ever come across sort of marginal comments that are a particular age where you suddenly think, oh, this is when they started doing that? That's what I'm wondering. I'm just wondering why person number one didn't do it in the margin in the first place.
I suggestion that when we've finished, you come up and speak to Francesca. Because we're going to get kicked out of here very soon. So we need to,
Yes, it's good.
thank you. And thank you very much for your paper. I'm just
Glad you enjoyed it.
for your questions as well. Our next meeting is on the 18th of January. It's a paper by Alexandra Plain, sorry, with a paper entitled Reconstructing the Scottish Library of King James VI and First, Buying, Donating and Binding Royal Books, 1570 to 1603. Could you please join me in just thanking Francesca for her paper with me?